Welcome everyone. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here. I have a couple of slides prepared for the discussion today. And as Lee mentioned, today's discussion is around CSE entity groups, right? And how we can use them to automate some of the functionality, right? Especially how to automate updating or tagging entities within the Cloud SIEM enterprise environment. So my name is Laszlo Salamon. I've been with Sumo Logic for about 2.5 years on the professional services team. And prior to that, I worked at an MSSP in a security operations center role and spent many years in the financial sector, just doing general information security, including more or less all of the pillars of information security. So again, just, because it's fitting in this scenario, right, for some of our Sumo Logic values, right, we're in it with our customers, meaning, right, we actually like to get a lot of feedback from customers or as much as possible, right, which helps us not only make our product better, but also deliver our services more effectively. And then, of course, bringing light to dark, right, it's about getting all of this data into a single pane of glass in most of the cases, right, to help our customers really make security decisions and best practices in their environment. So just quickly, I wanted to touch on recent CSE features, right, in case you're not following the notifications as you're connected to CSE. But some of the recent features that were deployed in the last quarter or so are first seen rules and entity timelines, right? So first seen rules are a new type of rule that we can leverage based on a baseline where we can identify an activity from a user, an asset, or an entity for the first time. And then additionally, the entity timelines were introduced, right, which then give you basically a time view of what other activities occurred on that entity, right, broken down by either signals or records or insights in an easy readable pane. To add additional context, right, or more feature functionality to entity timelines, we also introduced the relationship graph here, right? So I just put an example on the screen here, which can then, right, show you, right, what other entities were involved within the records potentially that generated an insight, which also gives you the flexibility to now drill down into those related entities to get additional context for your investigations. So really nice features. We've had some good feedback, but of course, if you do have any feedback around it, don't hesitate to contact your Sumo account team, and they will put you in touch with our content team. So with that, I'll start into, right, entity groups within the Cloud SIEM enterprise, right? What they are, why we use them, how we can effectively incorporate them into our environment so that it makes our investigations and detection capabilities that much richer and easier. So first, right, let's touch on entity. I'm sure many of you already know what they are within CSE, right? But ultimately, an entity is the central to the process of how CSE identifies activities, right? So we all know that a signal is generated on an entity, which then increments the activity score of said entity. And then ultimately, if it surpasses or breaches the threshold that's predefined in your environment, then it will escalate it into an entity insight, I should say, which then provides you a clustering of signals, basically all of the activities or the anomalous activities that occurred around that entity, right? So some examples of an entity can be a host name, a username, IP address. We used to have only a handful of predefined entities in the environment, but since I want to say about 8 months ago, it was drastically expanded on, right? So now you have a lot more entity types that you can select when you're building a rule. But of course, you are not limited to the predefined entities. You can create your own custom entities for that matter, right? Based on any field within a normalized record. So when is an entity actually created, right? So the entity is only created in CSE if a signal has been generated by one of the rules. But if you wanted to, let's say, tag your entities ahead of time and you have a static inventory of some sort, you could technically import your entities, right, just so they're in the system. And then you can apply certain tags and criticality groups, which I will be going into a little bit more detail, so that you actually pre-configure prior to waiting for a signal to be generated. So that's basically right how entities are treated within CSE. So what are the entity groups, right? So obviously the name indicates that it's a grouping of entities, but besides grouping of entities, its core function is really so that we can apply other context to it, right? Meaning we can actually change how activity score is generated on a specific entity using criticality groups. We can also use it to suppress signals, right, on any of the entities that are predefined or listed within the group. And then also we can use it to tag these entities. Now, tagging can be very beneficial because, right, you can then determine potentially what type of asset that specific entity is, whether it's critical, how critical it is to your operation. But also these tags are now pushed down to the record level, right, which we'll get into on the next slide here, right? So ultimately what these groups are doing is assigning attributes. And the way we can automate this is by assigning attributes based on values, meaning a value from within a record, right? Or also inventory. So if you have a static inventory source, for example, like Active Directory or Azure AD, right? We can ingest that as a source within our SIP environment, right? Our continuous intelligence platform. And then we forward that inventory data to CSE, which in turn then enriches all of the entity information, right? So we can actually take that inventory now and use it to, again, tag, add criticality groups, or even suppress signals based on those entity tags. So what are the most common, right? Why use entity groups? We could, as I mentioned, right, technically we could import entities through the use of metadata imports within CSE. But, what if you have a dynamic environment where, good example is always, right, you have potentially, executive users, right, or critical assets that are predefined in your inventory based on the group membership potentially, right? So these entity groups, because they can be dynamic, right, you don't have to go back and manually now update or import those tags or lists within CSE environment. So the automation aspect, right, is, again, we can apply these tags based on predefined conditions, right? And then not only can we assign it to the entity itself, but as I mentioned earlier, that information, especially from the tags perspective, is now pushed to the record level, which we can then leverage in our rules, right? So we may want to actually build a rule that is specific to a tag that we predefine. So going forward, we can actually then only generate signals based on that value itself. And then, of course, finally, again, we can also apply suppression, right? So again, this is making suppression of signals also in an automated fashion, right? Because now we don't have to manually go and add entities to a suppressed list, right? Or values to suppressed list, because the entity groups themselves will be predefined, therefore will be applied to real-time data. Okay. So to cover a use case, right? So I'm going to step through the actual configuration. I already did some pre-configuration so that we have actual data that we can look at in real time. But the common use case is, right, entity criticality. So PCI, of course, being, PCI assets or entities are being typically more important to an environment, right? So in those cases, what we want to establish is, right, is that if a signal is generated on a PCI entity in this case, right, we want to surface insights earlier, right? Meaning any activity that occurs on these entities, we want the signals to be ranked higher, right? So if we have severity of 2, let's say, for a signal, right, through the use of these entity groups, we can then increment those values. And then, of course, also have the ability to create custom rules, right, focused on specifically PCI entities. So in this case, if we ever wanted to build a rule, right, we can leverage now that information within the records to build additional custom use cases. So in this use case, again, the success criteria or the outcome desired here is to be able to surface insights earlier in the stage, and then also the ability to create custom rules focused on those specific PCI entities. So what we know from, let's say, in the customer environment is, right, that the servers, anything related to PCI servers, right, that are serving information are grouped within an Active Directory group. And then let's say, you know, point of sales devices, right, they maybe use a consistent naming convention, or they have, specific subnets that are leveraged where we can then take advantage of the actual IP address ranges to then assign information. So to actually accomplish this, right, what we can do is, first, what we're going to do is establish an entity criticality, right? So in this case, the desire, again, is to surface insight earlier in the stage. So therefore, we're going to create an entity criticality group to then escalate those severities. We also want to then create a tag schema, right, for consistency's sake, right? We want to apply tags for the PCI entities so that this tag is now relayed down to the record level. And then, of course, we're going to establish the entity group itself. And basically what we'll do is create two specific groups, one to assign criticality based on AD inventory, right? Because we know that our servers are grouped within Active Directory. And then another one is to actually assign a tag for the point of sales devices, right? So we'll call that PCI assets as an example. And then finally, right, we'll create a rule and see how we can then now leverage this specific tag that was applied to the entities or the records for that matter. Okay. So I have a session up here, so I'll just walk through. I'll actually roll back to the previous slide so we can follow it. So the first thing that we're, of course, going to do is first establish the entity criticality, right? So for that, we can go to our CSE environment, right? Find our entities criticality section here. And of course, we're going to create one for PCI entity severity, right? So technically, I already have one in the background, but I just want to step through how this is done. And what we can do here is then create, right, a mathematical operation, right? So we can take the severity of the actual signal, and then we can either multiply by a factor, right? We can add, right, or even negate, right? So there will be scenarios where you can take advantage of these entity criticality groups to also lower the severity of assets, right? So in our case, you know, we decided with the customer that we actually want to, you know, multiply the severity of every signal by 3, which is a little bit aggressive, right? But they really wanted to focus in on almost every signal that is generated on that on those entities, just in case they are under attack. So once we create our severity group, right? So I already established one here with the same name. Then we move on to our next step, which is right now, let's create a tag schema. So tag schemas are nice to use because you can actually standardize how these tags can then be used across the platform, right? So they're not limited to only entity tagging, right? You can use these tag schemas for tagging signals, right? Tagging insights and so on. So you likely saw these already, right? So we have, of course, our MITRE attack tactic and techniques already predefined, but you can, of course, create your own type. So what I did here is created a tag schema here, right? Calling it entity type, where we will be using this to assign to entity. But as you can see here, right, you can technically use this same schema, and you can also use it in rules or custom insights if you wanted to. So what you can do is just add it to the list here. And then I define the actual values that will be available under this specific entity key, right, which I call entity type. So I created one for PCI servers and one for PCI point of sales devices. Okay, so now we have our criticality group established. We have our tag schema established. So now we can go ahead and set up the entity group. Now, one thing I will call out, right, with the tag schema, this is not a necessary step technically, because you can assign just keyword tags. So as you're creating the entity group, you can just put any tag of your choice, right, any string that will also be applied. But again, this keeps it consistent across the board. So let's go and create the actual entity groups. So in this case, we will be creating one for the PCI servers, right? So let's call that PCI servers list, for example, right? We can also set a description. And then here is where we then determine, right, do we want to use values from records or do we want to use the inventory? So assuming that you have an inventory source already coming into the system, right? In this case, we will be tagging computers where the inventory data coming from Active Directory is in a group called PCI servers. Right? So I know I'm reusing PCI servers, but this is the group within the Active Directory infrastructure. So what will we do once we identify inventory where the in this case the computer is within that PCI servers group? We are going to apply the tags that we defined in our previous step. So again, here technically you have the right option to just add keyword or anything you like as a tag, but for consistency's sake, right, we created the entity type key, and then we are going to assign PCI servers as a tag. Then we also define the criticality group. So therefore, we're going to assign the PCI entity severity group, where we basically took the severity of any signal that is generated, and we are multiplying it by a value of 3. If, however, you wanted to, of course, use an entity group to suppress, you do have the option to now suppress. Now, you don't have to necessarily select not suppressed here, right? You can just save it in a blank state here. So we will go ahead and create this specific entity group. So from this point on, once an entity is created, this group will then apply the tag and also escalate the severity of that, of any signal generated on that entity when it's generated. The other one was we want to tag the PCI point of sales devices potentially, right? So I already created one here just because I wanted to get some tags into the records, but it's basically the same set of steps. The only difference here is that, right, we're using values. And in my case, I used IP addresses, but you could, of course, if you had a consistent host name convention, right, you can use a host name, then you can actually use a prefix, right? So maybe your POS devices all start with the, value POS underscore. And then again, we're assigning now the entity PCI POS tag here and the same criticality group. Okay, so again, in my case, I just use the IP address because that's what I have available in my test environment here. So now we have established the 2 entity groups, right? So first we established the criticality group, then we established the consistent tagging, and now finally the entity groups. So going forward, any signal that's generated, it will then inherit that severity group. It will apply the required tags that we outlined here. And these tags will then be available to use within rule expressions because they are reflected within the records. Okay. So now that we have this established, right, let's take a look how rules would look, right? So using the example of point of sales devices or the servers. So I think I set up 2 example rules here, again, just to demonstrate how they work, right? So in this case, I called this one SSL connection, right? Very basic. I, again, was just trying to generate some signals on this specific IP address in this case, right? And we have, in this case, I actually set the severity to 0 because I didn't want it to influence any other monitoring that's occurring in the environment. But if I set this to a severity 1, right, then when the signal is generated, technically it would be escalated into a severity 3 in this case. So now that we have an example from, right, in this case, just a specific device that I was honing in on, let's look at how one would use now said tags. Actually, before I go there, let me open up one of the signals that we have here to step through the actual signal and show you where the tags are now located within the record itself. So if we look at the full details of this record, but before I actually click in there, right, we will also see the tags displayed in the details section. And actually this was prior to this, so let me just move over to here, fields, and it is in the other rule. Navigate to my other rule here where I'm using the tags. Right, so in this case, here's the configuration, but just to show you where the tags are located within the record. Once a signal is generated on an entity, right, we will see that there's a field tags now available, right? And again, this is on the record level itself, which is why we can then reference it in our rule here. Go back to the editor, right? So as you can see, similar to how we use match lists, right, for with an array contains operator, or also threat lists, the fields tags works the same way. So in my case, it's field tags. I'm looking specifically if its destination IP is matched and the actual value of the tag schema that I created where, right, we set the key to entity type and then the values to the PCI POS. So again, very easy and automated way to then now take advantage of this, right? So now if you wanted to build additional custom rules around those entities, right, you can literally start with this line in your expression and then of course add to your expression as you see fit or as you need it for your use case. So in this case, again, we are addressing the success criteria, right? What is the desired outcome just by simply setting up a handful of configurations within CSE. So that's all I had from demo perspective. Happy to answer any questions if you have. Happy to walk through some examples if you have. Checking Q&A, no questions. If anyone has any questions, feel free to come off mute and state them. Anyone find this where they already have some ideas of using it or potential use for it? No questions. Okay. Well, I really appreciate everyone's time. Keep in mind, we do have, right, additional brown bag sessions coming up. So if you've registered for them, of course, you'll receive them automatically.
Hey, Paul did put a question in the Q&A there, Laszlo. I'm not sure if it's a question or if it's just a comment there.
Paul, yeah, thanks for the comment. We'll be experimenting with escalating signals for admin activity. Yeah, perfect use case, right? Again, like take your admin accounts, especially if they're in a inventory source, very easy to tag them and hence, right, escalate signals across the board. Very good use case. But yeah, so these are our upcoming brown bag sessions, right? So we have one for security coming up on May 16th, but of course, please attend the other ones too. Can be very beneficial and help you answer any questions. We have a hand up, Julian. Julian, did you have a question or comment?
No, I don't have any question or comment. Thank you.
Okay, no, I saw a hand up. Sounds good. All right. Well, I really hope it was beneficial. Again, trying to scope it so it's very specific topics. If anyone does have any follow-up questions, please let us know, reach out to your account team or myself directly, and happy to answer any questions.